There's the Pythagorean theorem, named the Pythagorean theorem after the Greek mathematician Pythagoras that lived around 600 BC. But the Chinese actually came up with it about 5,000 years before that. I don't remember exactly, but 500 or 1,000 years before that. They came up with it way before Pythagoras did, but they were in China and we were focusing on the Greeks. So what it is literally, why is the square of the hypotenuse equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides? Well, if we draw a right triangle and we were to make squares off of the sides of the triangles, the area of this square plus the area of this square equals the area of this square. When Pythagoras came up with this, he was literally talking about the area of these two squares is equal to the area of this square. They didn't have variables or addition the way we know it now. So what we do is we call one of these A, we call one of these B, and C is always the hypotenuse. Now the legs don't matter. This could be B, this could be A, that's fine. Use that Pythagorean theorem to find the length of a side of a triangle. Well, let's say the C wasn't already labeled. We'd go across here and say, oh, that's C. Okay.
So we do 10 squared plus 24?
A squared plus B squared is equal to C squared. So it doesn't matter. This could be A, this could be B. A and B doesn't matter, but I'm just going to go AB. So I will do 10 squared plus 24 squared is equal to C squared. So you plug in the values you have.
And you get a calculator.
So I have 100 plus 576. Thank you. Is equal to C squared. So 676 is equal to C squared. And then we're going to take the square root of both sides. Okay, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And now I don't know the square root of 676, so I'm going to make my factor tree.
Why? It's 26.
Is it? Okay, well, I'm going to pretend I don't know that. $169. Ooh, I do know this one. That's 13. Oh, yes, and look at that. I have a pair of 2s and a pair of 3s, 13s. So 2 times 13 is 26. I know, I'm doing it without a calculator, though.
Don't be sassy. I did it without a calculator. How do you know if it's
22.
So 2 times 88, and that's 2 times 44, which is 2 times 22, which is 2 times 11. And I have 2 pairs of 2s. Bless you. So B is equal to 2 times 2, 1 for each pair, and that square root of 11 stays behind. So it is equal to 4 times the square root of 11. Set up. What number goes here?
64.
Well, okay. Well, for A, so you want to make it 8,
Yeah.
and number goes here. And does there go any number here?
No.
Okay.
We'll find out.
So we have 64 plus 36 equals C squared. I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and the square root of 100 is 10. So the Pythagorean formula says a squared plus b squared equals 6 squared. Well, This is for a right triangle, correct? Yeah.
You said 6 squared. Where does it say 6?
I'm in B. Well, if I have a squared plus b squared and it does not equal c squared, it's not a right triangle. Okay? So if it does equal c squared, it is a right triangle, and if it does not equal c squared, it is not a right triangle. A Pythagorean triple occurs when you have 3 whole numbers. Why did I put a plus there?
So 3 whole numbers? Whole numbers.
3 whole numbers that make a squared plus b squared plus c squared true. So like the smallest Pythagorean triple I know of is 3, 4, 5. 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25. 9 plus 16 equals 25. And then we have Pythagorean triples make this true because 3 squared plus 4 squared does equal 5 squared. Yes, so it's a Pythagorean triple. So Pythagorean triples are when whole numbers make it true. So what we're doing is, when we're checking to see, does this make a right triangle? What number is C?
16.
16. Because C is always the longest, right?
Yeah.
So C is the longest side, so it's the biggest number. And then A and B, it doesn't matter. I can call A and B, or I can say B and A. Those don't matter. So I'm going to check. Except I'm going to put a little question mark there. Is it true? Does it equal that? Well, let's try it. If I do 9 squared plus 12 squared, does that equal 16 squared? So I have 81 plus 144 and 256. Well, 81 plus 144 is 5, 2, carry my 1, 225.
So close.
So it does not equal 256. So no, it is not a right triangle.
So that's where a calculator would
It
come.
has to be 112.
Fact about Pythagorean triples.
They're ugly.
3, 4, 5 is the smallest Pythagorean triple. Every multiple of 3, 4, 5 is also a Pythagorean triple. So 6, 8, 10, 9, 12, 15. So 30, 40, 50 was times 10 each. So every multiple of this would also be a Pythagorean triple. That's just a little interesting side fact. Let's try 6, 12, and 18. If we're given 2 points on a coordinate plane, and the first set of points is x1, y1, and x2, y2. The little numbers in the bottom just mean that this is the first x, and then this means it's the second x. That's all that means. We can calculate the distance between them using this formula.
I forget what subscripts mean in that.
They just indicate that these are 2 different x's. So this is the first x, that's the second x. That's all that means. So here's the formula. Okay, what we do, now you can set either of these points. I could say this was x1, or I could say this was x1. It doesn't matter. I usually just go in order. x1, y1, x2, y2. Now, what you don't want to do is go, oh, x1, x2. No, 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 no. This is an x and a y. Okay. Then I take my formula.
So why do you square root it all?
Well, first you have to do everything underneath the square root. So first I'm going to plug in, okay, I said x2 was 1 and x1 is 5. And then y2 is negative 2, and y1 is 3. So I plug them in.
That's not.
You forgot the square.
Thank you. So I plug those in. Now I add or subtract inside the parentheses first. So that's negative 4 squared plus negative 5 squared. Now you'll notice I'm keeping them inside the parentheses, and that's important. The reason I kept these in parentheses is it's important because there's a difference between negative 4 squared and negative 4 in parentheses squared. This is negative 16 because that squared is not affecting the negative. It only affects what it's touching, and it's only touching the 4. However, this is positive 16 because it's touching the parenthesis, so everything inside is affected. So I always leave the parentheses in so that there's not a mistake, and you don't write negative 16 when you need it to be positive. Does that make sense? Maybe, yeah. That's probably good if you need that note. So until you square them, just to be careful. So this ends up being the square root of 16 plus 25, which ends up being the square root of, 41. And that can't be simplified because 41 is prime. So I'm done.
So D equals.
Square root of 41. So the distance between these 2 points is the square root of 41. So if we have all negatives,
Okay, so when you do negative 5, are you going to do minus negative 7 or just negative 5 minus 7?
negative 5 minus negative 7. So it's going to be like this. Negative 5 minus negative 7. I forgot the squareds. And then squared plus negative 8 minus negative 2 squared. So that's negative 5 plus 7
What do you mean plus 7?
minus a negative.
So when you write the problem, it's negative 5 minus a negative 7.
Right, but negative 5 minus a negative becomes plus. Minus negatives, remember I guys showed you that little smiley face guy?
Yeah.
So anytime I minus a negative, it becomes a positive. So this would be 2 squared plus negative 6 squared. So this would be the square root of 4 plus 36, which is the square root of 40, which is 2 times the square root of 10. Because 40 is 4 times 10, and 4 is a perfect square. 10 is not. So that's how I knew that so fast.
0 and
12. Because this is my x-axis, this would be my y-axis.
So it has to be like that, or can you switch the numbers? Like, can you do 0 and 9 and then 0 and 12?
No, you can't have 0, 9 and 0, 12. They have to be, one has to be 0 and a number, and the other one has to be the number and then 0. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because if we pretend that this is like an xy axis, these are x's and these are y's, so I'm going up 12 on the y-axis. I'm going across 9 on the x-axis. Does that make sense? Okay. So one of them has to have the 0 in front, and the other one has to have the 0 in behind. Now, I could have maybe like rotated the room, and this been 0, 12, and this been, or sorry, this been 12, 0, and this been 0, 9. That would have been okay. Does that make sense?
And who would tell you that? Can we put 0?
So then we can plug those numbers into the distance formula. Which one do you want to be the 1s, and which one do you want to be the 2s?
2 should be 1.
Okay. So this is x1, y1, and this is x2, y2. All right, so, no, this can be 2s and this can be 1s. That part doesn't matter. So if I do 9 minus 0 squared plus 0 minus 12 squared. I get 9 squared plus 12 squared, negative 12 squared, sorry. So I get 81 plus 144. Yes. So I get the square root of 225, which is 15 feet. So it says at least 13 feet away, right?
So you could move up 2 more
So
feet
yes, it's long enough.
and go up 2 more.
If we call this x1, and we call this y1, and then this is x2, and that's y2, and the distance d is 5. We have x1, y1, x2, y2, and the distance is 5 units. So that's d. So we take the same formula, right? x1, can't write, hold on. So d equals the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. And I'm going to plug in every number I have. So d is 5. X2, we don't have a number for that, that's a. Minus 4 plus y2 minus y1, so 3 minus 7 squared. Now, after I've plugged everything in, I have to simplify what's under the square root. So I'm going to FOIL this part. Right, so I have to, a minus 4 squared is a minus 4 times a minus 4 is what's happening. And then 3 minus 7 is negative 4 squared. So I'm going to FOIL, so it's first, let's do that. First, outside, inside, and last. That's the multiplication.
So it's 2 negative 4a's? Or
No. Yeah. So I have a squared, that's a times a, minus 4a, minus 4a plus 16. That's this part FOILed. Plus negative 4 squared gives me that second 16. Okay. So I'm just going to put like parentheses there. So this was the first part FOILed and this was the second part squared. I'm just showing you where the parts were. You don't need the parentheses. So now I keep going. I'm not completely simplified yet. So a squared is by itself. Negative 4 and negative 4 together make negative 8. And then 16 and 16 is 32. All right, so once we've simplified the square root completely, you're going to square both sides. So 5 squared is 25. And what happens when you square a square root is that the square root goes away. So you just write down everything that was underneath. Okay. Then I need to set equal to 0 and solve. All right, so I'm going to subtract 25 from both sides. So basically at that point I have a squared minus 8a, 32 minus 25 is 7 equals 0. Now we can solve this a couple different ways. I can either complete the square, I could factor it, or I could use the quadratic equation. Preferences? Okay. So we're here, right? And I want to show you like ways to solve this. So the first way I'm going to do it is by factoring. Okay, so I could factor this. Guys, remember the big giant X? I'm looking for two numbers that when I multiply them, they'll give me a 7, but when I add them, they'll give me a negative 8.
8, -1.
Nope, they need to multiply to make 7.
Oh. 1 and 7.
1 and 7. And if I make them both negative, they'll multiply to make a positive, and they'll add to make a negative. So this is going to be a minus 1 times a minus 7 equals 0. And then I set each of these equal to 0. So a minus 1 equals 0. So I add 1 to both sides.
Can you go back to the step right after you find out what the numbers were?
Here,
Yeah.
That's a long.
once I find the numbers, I just put them in the parentheses with the a. Does that?
Will we have a
Okay.
problem like this on our homework?
Yes. Okay.
So it's two, there's two.
Two answers. Anytime you have a squared, you're going to get two answers.
And what is the other one?
Quadratic formula. Everybody, x equals a negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so negative b. b is negative 8, so it's negative negative 8 plus or minus b squared minus 4 times a times c
Yeah, but how do you get?
over 2 times a. So I plugged in.
Like, how do you know it's a 1 and a
If
7?
there's no number there, that's a 1. This is b, and that's c. So whatever number is here is a, this is b, that's c. And since there's no number there, it's a 1. So that equals 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 28 over 2, which equals 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 28, don't feel like it, 36 over 2. So that equals 8 plus or minus the square root of 36 is 6. So that's 8 plus 6 divided by 2 and 8 minus 6 divided by 2 because it's plus or minus. So I have to do both. So that's 14 divided by 2 and 2 divided by 2. So far so good? So 7 and 1.
Oh, wow.
It's a matter of preference. You can't always factor, but you can always use the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula will work 100% of the time. I'm going to call this x1, y1, x2, y2, and this is d. And I'm going to plug them into my distance formula. So I have x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Oops, except I forgot to put the 10 in for the d. Sorry. So 10 equals negative 8 squared plus 2 minus b times 2 minus b. So that's 64 plus first, outside, inside, last. So 10 is equal to, and then I'm going to rearrange these so that they look all pretty. B squared minus 4b plus 68. And then I'm going to square both sides. we need to square both sides. So I get 100 is equal to b
Everything.
squared minus 4b plus 68. Now I need to set this equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 100 from both sides.
Ouch.
And I'm going to get 0
Negative 32.
is equal to b squared minus 4b minus 32. Factor or quadratic formula?
Oh,
Okay, so I'm going to find
So you
two
have to
things
do
that'll
that or not?
multiply to 32 and add to negative 4. You have to either factor or do quadratic formula.
Add to 4.
They're going to multiply and make a negative 32, and when I add them, I'm going to get a negative 4. So let's start thinking about things that multiply to make 32. 8 and 4. And if I have one positive and one negative, right?
It'd be a negative
Negative 8. So this is going to be b minus 8, b plus 4 equals 0.
Yep, I got it. Okay.
And I'm going to split those up and set them each equal to 0.
So your answer is like positive 8, negative 4.
Yep, so you get your positive 8 and your negative 4. Yeah, we do.
Yeah, just go.
All right, midpoint. The midpoint is the middle point
You don't say.
on a segment, which is equal distance from the two ends. Okay, now you can't have a midpoint on a line because a line technically goes on forever. You can only have a midpoint on a line segment because it has to have like a measurable length to find out where the middle is. We can find the midpoint formula if the end points are x1, y1, and x2, y2. Then the midpoint is x1 plus x2 divided by 2 and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And this gives you a point. So you add the x's divided by 2 and then you add the y's and divide it by 2 and that gives you the coordinates of the midpoint. So if I have these two endpoints here, by the way, I never write out midpoint anymore. That's midpoint. So it's x1, x2, y1, y2. So if I plug these in, I have negative 1 plus 3 divided by 2, and then 2 minus 4, or plus negative 4, however you like to look at it. So this gives me 2 over 2 and negative 2 over 2. So that's 1, negative 1. That is the midpoint.
You said